Let me first take you to the first 3 slides that you will see. There are different ways of presenting the same thing. That is, how does land relate to conflict? In the first slide, you will see I've listed a number of underlying issues that you can find when you enter into a conflict-affected environment, and that have to do with land. There can be a scarcity of land. In a lot of vulnerable countries, you will see that there's been an explosive population growth, and that increasingly the land is unable to support the population, which, for example, in countries like Burundi, is still relying on subsistence farming. This becomes an enormous stress factor, which in and by itself may not be enough to lead to conflict, but when conflict arises, these stress factors start playing a role. You may have had land degradation. Increasingly, with climate change, you see that there are areas that are at the same time often also conflict-affected areas, where the land becomes of less and less quality, putting pressure on the land and raising tension amongst population and communities alike. There may be certain identity groups, certain minorities that do not have access to viable land. It's very important, this concept of viable land. It's not about access to land per se, it's about access to viable land. When we look at a country like Yemen, where land is one of the main sources of violence in the south of the country, you see that only about 5% of the territory of Yemen is actually arable land. And so the other 95% is desert, and the tension is around those 5% and not, of course, around the 95%. There may be unresolved, very long-standing grievances around land and property. One of the remarkable elements of land is that people will have very long memories as to when they were dispossessed from land. You'll go into a country like Rwanda, and people will be talking about dispossessions going back 40, 50 years that affected their family. Again, this may not be enough to actually cause conflict, but when conflict arises, if you look at it as a period of intense social change, you will very often have these historical dispossessions coming back forward, and groups trying to use the conflict to get their justice the way they see it, and therefore causing tension with other groups. Unequal distribution of land. In many countries, land is very unequally distributed. Again, something that doesn't necessarily in and by itself leads to conflict, but that may be one of the underlying stresses that will come out, and that in the post-conflict environment you will need to look at especially the national governments, will need to look at as something that needs to be addressed if you don't want to relapse into conflict very soon after. There may simply be a large number of unresolved land and property disputes. If you have conflict, you very often have a breakdown in dispute resolution mechanisms. And I'm not just thinking about the courts, and we'll come back to dispute resolution mechanisms later on. I'm also thinking specifically about more traditional ways of resolving disputes. When you look in Western Côte d'Ivoire after the elections, when there was conflict, the traditional leaders that had in the past dealt with land conflicts lost authority for a number of reasons. They lost authority because very often they became part of the conflict and they took sides. And therefore they were unable to resolve disputes involving people that had supported 2 different sides during the conflict. But they also became displaced. And that allowed the younger people in their own family to say, listen, our traditional structures haven't functioned. Look, we have had conflict, we have had unemployment, we don't have any prospects. We now want to take power and we want to manage the land of the family. So you get a lot of intra-family disputes that the traditional leaders can no longer resolve. And in a post-conflict environment, you need to look at that, because otherwise you have these land disputes piling up without necessarily finding a solution, which then leads to private violence or larger scale violence. You can have had widespread tenure insecurity. You've heard about the concept of land tenure security and insecurity in one of the first modules that you took. Very often in conflict in volatile environments, you have very weak land tenure security, whereby people can occupy a piece of land, but they never know whether the day after they will not be pushed out by more powerful actors or by other families, and so on. And then you can have agrarian and land reforms in the past, which were very badly digested by the countries or the communities in question, which still have left a set of grievances that are there when you come into the conflict. Which leads me to one very important point, which is, and far too often when people enter a country, when the influx of donor money starts, when the influx of agencies start looking at land in a country in the transitional environment as if nothing ever happened before. And in this context of where agrarian and land reforms of the past can have led to deep feelings of grievances that have come out during the conflict, unless you understand and know about these land reforms in the past before the conflict, you'll never be able to do a programming intervention that is viable or that is appropriate. I'd like to take you to the next slide where we pose the question, is dealing with land we often talk about the conflict cycle, but is it not very often, especially when it comes to land, a circle? And there's 5 moments. There's the grievances moment, there's the insecurity moment, there's the conflict moment, the peace negotiations, and the post-conflict. And when you look at the slide, when we are at the grievances moment, you'll have latent land issues, and I've listed some of those related to the earliest land, which may be related to access to land, historical injustices, insecure tenure, environmental pressures. Then we come to a period of increased insecurity, where you have a mobilization of land issues. Very often land issues is something around which conflict operators, people who, local elites, national elites, who for some reason want the country to go into a conflict situation, they can mobilize people around. They can say, remember, your grandfather lost the land 40 years ago, and this is yet another sign that the current regime, if it's a rebel movement, is not working in your interest. And people find it land is a very easy target for people who want to mobilize people around conflict. We have institutions that starts to weaken, that starts to lose legitimacy, that are less and less used by citizens. If institutions weaken, institutions, again, not just state institutions, but also traditional institutions, actors, powerful, less powerful, will start moving. They will start taking land. Land grabbing will start to increase, maybe by elites, maybe by foreign investors, maybe simply by families who are waiting for an opportunity to take the land that they never had. When I was working in Baghdad in 2006, in some of the mixed areas, you simply had families. You had a Shia family on the one hand, looking across the road, and as soon as a Sunni family had been moved out by the militia, by the Shia militia, often at the encouragement of the family, they would take their bags and they would walk over to the house. Not because they had a claim on the house, not because they were conflict operators, but simply it was an opportunity for them to get a bigger house and to live in more decent circumstances. So when institutions weaken, you have that sort of dynamics at the macro level and the micro level going on. When the conflict then starts, which is the third phase in my circle drawing, you have displacement. Displacement, I already said, it comes with a number of things. It comes with the occupation of land. It comes with stresses in the places where people are moving to, where land disputes often increase. You have institutional collapse during conflict, and it's very important when you think about programming, and sometimes I'm surprised when I see programming ideas being presented. After conflict, institutions are almost invariably weaker as before conflict. So land management institutions, if they were unable to do a large-scale land titling prior to the conflict, they're most likely even less likely to be able to do that after the conflict, just exactly because during the conflict, most of the institutions will collapse, not always, but will often weaken. Land and resources, of course, can fuel and sustain the conflict. When you look at many of the rebel movements in DRC, you cannot explain how long they've been able to sustain the fighting that they do unless you look at the access and the control that they have to land and the natural resources that are either on or under the land. And new land and property relations form. It's very important, again, and I already said this, to look at conflict as a way of social change. In Western Côte d'Ivoire, maybe the traditional way of resolving land disputes was a great way, but is it likely that you can put everything back together in the post-conflict environment the way it was before? No, because land and property relations have changed. Whether they've changed for the better or the worse is a separate discussion, but they have changed. Then we come to peace negotiations. It's very important to see that during peace negotiations, things around land will still be on the move. Land grabbing will persist. Actors will try to consolidate whatever it is that they gained during the conflict. Are the land issues included in negotiations, or are they too sensitive to be included in the negotiations and they're given to a commission who will then deal with the sensitive issues later down the line? If they're not included in peace negotiations, it's very important to understand why they were not included. Was it because they were not important enough, or was it that they were so sensitive that the main political actors could not find an agreement? Well, if they couldn't find an agreement and they gave it to a land commission, then you can almost say that be certain that the land commission will face important political problems down the line. Doesn't mean that the land commission should not be supported, but does mean that you need to understand the political economy of land around that to be able to provide proper support and not just technical support to a land commission like was established, for example, in Iraq after 2003 to deal with 160,000 claims of people who were dispossessed under Saddam Hussein. In the post-conflict environment, you will have new land issues arising, and some of those land issues could be qualified as peace dividends. When displaced populations can return to their homes, that's great. That's a dividend of the peace. At the same time, that could lead to a whole new set of land disputes when these people then find when they return home that their land has been occupied by others. Often you'll see that the land market very rapidly changes. The value of land will increase very rapidly. In Baghdad, I was surprised to see how quickly, after the security improved, land values started to rapidly increase in some of the areas that had become more secure, which often has very strong implications for poor people who can then no longer have access to housing. Again, that could become an issue related to conflict or instability when then these people have no longer access to houses, makes them maybe more vulnerable to being used by conflict operators, for example. Structural problems that were there before the conflict, as I already said, will persist also in the post-conflict transitional area. Any structural issues that were there with the land management institutions will still be there after the conflict. And if you don't address that properly at that particular moment in time, not address it as US aid, but as national actors together with international actors, then you come into a circle, because then there is a whole new set of grievances that is formed in this post-conflict environment. The third slide divides up the land issues in the urgent, the old, and the new, and I will not go into it very much because I would be repeating myself, but you see it's another way of presenting what you will be confronted with when you look at land issues in these transitional environments.